Hi, I'm Josh. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be doing Friday Reads, where I'll be discussing rereading the entire Wayward Children series. All of it, as well as Over the Woodward Wall. So let's get at it. So before I get into these, just a little bit of structure here. Friday Reads is traditionally where you talk about the books you're currently reading or you're going to read over the weekend. For those of you who aren't familiar with Friday Reads, I know it's not a mainstream thing on BookTube, but I like to use it more like a wrap-up, like an ongoing update for the week. So I'm going to talk first, of course, about the Wayward Children series and then about the Woodward Wall. But then there are a couple of books that I read this week, and then there are a couple of books that I'm reading right now that I hope to finish this weekend that I want to get to. So first, though, the main event that we're going to talk about is the Wayward Children series. And if you're not interested in hearing all of it, I'll make sure I have timestamps throughout the video. I decided to reread the Wayward Children series, I don't know when, it was probably late last year, because I knew the new one was coming out, which I don't have the new one on hand. I pre-ordered it, but there were some delays involved with that. But nevertheless, I read the new one as well. And before I do that, I wanted to reread this, because when I first read this, which I think I read it over the span of late 2019 through March of 2020, I wanted to pace myself because I knew I was going to love it. And I did. It was great to be able to spin it all out. So I had a much shorter time period to have to wait for the new book. But now that we're here, I wanted to reread it because I had a strong feeling this might be an all-time favorite, but it was hard to say that after only one reread. And now that I reread it, I don't regret rereading it because it's absolutely an all-time favorite. I love this series so much. I loved rereading it. Oh my god, it really just encapsulates everything that I love in a good story. It is fantastical, it is whimsical, it is at times absurd, but it's also emotional and dark and deals with serious topics and themes, and I expect nothing less from her. So I'm not going to spoil anything in this video, especially in these books, but I do want to talk about, I guess, how I'd rank them now that I read them side by side, because it gives me a better idea of how they all fit in the bigger story. So let's start one by one. First, book one is Every Heart a Doorway, and this is an introduction to the story, which sort of introduces us to the school. We have these kids who, because at some point in their childhood, they visited another world, kind of like Narnia, and then something happened and now they're back in our world. But to them, they feel like their world is more home, like this world doesn't fit them. And this follows one main narrative about one main character, where her main world is like in an underworld. But it also follows a number of other characters as we center around the school mostly to get this school narrative. And this is an example of one of the two ways that I think Sean McGuire tells these stories, which is to say focusing on a broad scale of characters and instead of just one particular story and within one world, kind of like a Narnia tale. And I really like this. It's a great introduction to the series. I absolutely adore it. Every book focuses on one character, even if it's looking at a lot of characters like in this one. And in doing that, each character has their own unique world to them, their own identity. And I like this world, the underground world, because it's dark, it's weird. It isn't my favorite world, but I still liked it. So obviously this is going to start here because there's nothing else here. Now we're on to book two, Design Among Sticks and Bones. And this follows characters from the first book, and it centers on their arc leading up to their time at the school. And this is essentially a backstory for them. And this story ends up being my favorite story of the entire series, even including book 6, because not only does it feel more contained as a sort of single story, it also it worked so well as characters in a world that I could really connect to. Like this is the Moors, it's called the Moors or something. Essentially think of it the world of monsters. Think vampires and Frankenstein. That is the world we're dealing with here. And this is the example of what this series can really be at its best. And when it's not at its best, it's still really good. But this is a story that deals with some serious themes. The world reflects our characters. The characters learn. They realize that things aren't always what they think. There's rarely a happy ending when it comes to these types of worlds. This is a much more realistic look at what these other worlds might look like when it's not Narnia, right? This is a much darker look. I say realistic. I think it's more realistic because the world can be dark. And that's the truth of reality, regardless of if we're going to a different world or a different universe. I just loved it. I liked the dark, almost horror-esque world. This is even darker than the underworld, and it deals with some really dark themes. Our characters are very, very flawed, but I still love them. Some of my favorite characters in the series. So this then takes spot number 1 in the series. Then we move on to book 3, Beneath the Sugar Sky. This follows the confection is what it's called, which is essentially a nonsense world of candy and bakeries. Like everything's basically made of candy and baked goods. And because it's nonsense, it means the laws of reality don't really make sense. Things don't flow properly, time is all whimsy and whatever. While I may be a scientist, this world is the world that I identified most with. It's something that I would love the opportunity to experience. I'd love to go to this world where everything just breaks apart, where there is no sense to the world, it just is. And then of course, candy and baked goods. I love it all. If I felt like one of these worlds had to encapsulate me and my identity, it would be this one, because I think it's my desire for nonsense that drives me in science, because I know there's a structure, let's try and figure it out, even though I like to fantasize about this. Even to this day, I'm 30 years old, and I can still dream that I can have magic, that I can fly, and why that doesn't present a problem in my dreams, I do not know. Like, I should know at this point that's not possible. Like, I had a dream, I've had multiple dreams now that I'm in a grocery store without a mask, and that registers. But this doesn't register when I fly, it doesn't register, I don't know, but it works. Like, I identify with this world. Now this returns to the same structure of book 1, where we're centering on one world, one character, but it does so by focusing on a range of characters at the school, and because of that, it just doesn't work as well as book 2. I don't think any of the stories that are sort of set at the school are as emotionally effective. Like, it's just not the same type of story, and it's still a fantastic story. So far, they're all 5 stars, to be clear, but when it comes to rating the next ones, it has to be not as good as the second one, and because it's not an intro, I don't think it has a profound impact. So even if it is my favorite world, it's still going to be, so far, number 3. Now moving on to In an Absent Dream, which then goes back to the single narrative, where we're focusing on another character from the school and their backstory. And this is a world, what is a world? It's like a goblin market of some sort, where it is the inverse of nonsense. There are some very strict rules, except it's this world of fairness where you have to be fair in your trading. And I loved it because the rules are so constrained. Like, that's what I love about these worlds, is that there's always a distinct frame of reference to that world. Even with book 3, with its nonsense, there's some sort of structure to the nonsense, and I love the creativity in which Shauna McGrath was able to present here in these worlds. And I love these worlds that really just go deep into the mythos of what it is she's doing. Then add in the fact that we have some just really interesting characters, especially this character and the things she has to think about, things she has to explore, and relationships she makes. And this one deals a lot with consequences. In particular, one big consequence being, if you're going to go to these worlds, you have to deal with the fact that you have to sacrifice something. In trying to get to their identity, their world that fits them, they have to give up the people they love, their family. They have to leave their family. This addresses that sort of loss that the family has to deal with, and the loss that the child has to deal with. And when that child is forced to face that, they have to decide which is better for them. Are they going to go to this world that is really meant for them, or are they going to stick with their family? And before I rate this, I want to go ahead and make a note of this idea of identity, because there is, I think, some serious imagery here of these worlds sort of being like gender identity, where you may have been born in the wrong body, but you are who you are. In this sense, these children, they're born in the wrong world, but these worlds they go to, they are the worlds they were meant to be in, even if they were born in the wrong one. And that is another reason why I think it is such a powerful narrative. And this one, oh God, it just works so well as an individual narrative with the themes it deals with, and that are connecting to the characters and the world building. So in that sense, it is one of the best, but it is not as good as the Moors. That means we have In Absent Dreams number 2, Down Among Sticks and Stones is number 1, and still the other 2 at the bottom. So you might see a theme here where I think the closed circuit stories are the best. They seem to be the best at being able to sort of connect us to the characters, or get me to connect to the characters. It's not that the other ones are bad. I like them because it changes the story structures and it gives us a different frame of reference, which gives us a new insight into the worlds, but I'm not able to connect to it in the same depth. These are all still 5 stars. They're still phenomenal books. I don't want to seem like I'm being extra critical of these books. Because of my love for them, I want to do this deep dive because it's just so much fun. I love talking about them. So now, moving on to book 5, Come Tumbling Down. And this now goes back to a school narrative, and again we return to another story, like another character who we've seen before. Basically a continuation of the book. You can't start with this book, that's for sure. These other books you could start with, especially Down Among Sticks and Bones and In an Absent Dream, because they're a closed story, but this one you really need to read the other ones first. And I really like this because, put it mildly, it returns to the story of book 2, and book 2 is my favorite. So we're getting a continuation of this narrative in a way that I'm very satisfied about. I'm very happy we did this, so that Sean McGuire gave us the opportunity to return to the story, because I wanted to know what else happened. I wanted to know what more there was to tell, and I think there was plenty to tell. But still, it isn't a closed story, and it feels like it's dependent on the other story, so it doesn't stand out on its own as well. In that sense, it doesn't really stand out as much as book 3 or book 1 anymore, because of the fact that it is dependent on the other stories. And to be clear, I am very happy we have this story, and I'd love to have more like it, because they're not all going to be the best, and I don't think every book has to be the best. I think we're going to be missing out if she has to try and remake the will every single time. I think it's enough to try and bring some completeness to what's already there to better round out the story. So I'm putting it last. Book 5 is last, unfortunately, but it's still a 5-star book. Now, let's talk about book 6. Okay, so now we have book 6, which is essentially the first story that really stands alone on its own. There is so far no connection to it to the rest of the books. So you could read it on your own if you wanted to. And maybe you should if you haven't read any, because I think it's a great story. But next to the others, I'll go ahead and tell you, it is last. It's not the best book. This story follows an intersex young girl who is dealing with identity and sharing her identity and sort of trusting people. And she ends up having to expose herself in a way that makes her feel very scared and harmed. So she runs for safety. And in doing so, she comes across this world. And this world is essentially a world of horses, and it feels very generic, honestly, in a lot of ways, in the sense that we have centaurs, we have, what do you call them? We have unicorns, we have other types of mythological horses that I wasn't familiar with before this. And while the world itself was still fun, the narrative was still very good. Everything connects, like the story of our main character and the things she has to deal with and the themes of her time in this world, they all mush together in a beautiful way that I think it really represents Sean McGuire's ability to tell a good, profound story. The problem is that while the story she may have experienced represents her, really helps her, I think, understand herself better, I don't think this world really represents her. The only connection to this world she really has is her love of horses. And that, to me, feels like a very mundane or simplistic connection compared to the connections we have in the other stories. The other stories, our characters connect to these worlds in such profound ways. And now we essentially have a character who connects to a world strictly because she loves horses. And sure, there are things she needs to experience within that world, but I don't think it is unique to the world. It was just unique to sort of the society, unique to the narrative of what's going on. And in that sense, it just doesn't work as effectively. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars because unfortunately it just did not work as well. I love the story, don't get me wrong, but unfortunately it has to go on the bottom of the list. I will go ahead and tell you, I went ahead and I reread it. I actually read this, then I reread it, but I'll go ahead and let's talk about how my process of rereading it. After I decided to reread this, which wasn't on my TBR originally, I figured, fuck it, I'm going to go all in and just, go off my TBR a bit. I went ahead and reread it because I wanted to see what it was like to re-experience it, especially since it was essentially kind of a disappointment relative to the other books. I wanted to know, is this really how I feel, or was I just overinflating it? Maybe it's too soon to do that kind of reread, but I didn't care. I wanted to reread it. I will go ahead and say I loved the reread. I loved it the first time and the second time. It didn't change its position in the stack of books, unfortunately. I think it did help me better appreciate how her home narrative and her own feelings connect so intimately with the narrative itself. Like, in that sense, it helped me appreciate the themes more, but I still felt the same way about the world and how it connects to her. So unfortunately, it still is on the bottom of the list. But now, to close this all off, let's talk about how Over the Woodward Wall fits into this. So this is the tangential novel to the Middle Game series. Like, it's the series that she quotes in that book. And this is a similar type of narrative where we have these kids who go to this magical world through some weird portal of sorts, and they have to sort of figure out how to survive. Now, this is very distinctly different, I think, than the Wayward Children's series because of the fact that these have to do with worlds that represent certain identities, or at least the characters we focus on. There is some talk about other schools that focus on students who go to worlds that have like a scarring effect on them, but these are about worlds that are meant for these students. While this one is about students, so these kids who go to this world that I don't think is meant for them. It's just a world they have to try and deal with. And in doing so, they learn some things about themselves and they have some growth. And in a lot of ways, there's like the same sort of tone here, the sort of dark, fantastical whimsy, but it isn't the same sort of narrative. Now, I still loved it. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars the first time I read it back in July of last year, and then I gave it 4.5 stars again. The first time I gave it 4.5 stars because I did not like the fact that the ending was kind of non-conclusive. I thought this would be like a full narrative, like with all of these. Even with the stories that connect to other stories, there's always a conclusive ending to that narrative of the story. This one, there's still much more to go. Now, I liked it more the second go around because I appreciated the fact that we had clear, distinct arcs that were concluding. Like, this part of the story is done. We've seen our characters go from A to B in a very natural and believable way. Believable in a nonsensical way. And now the next story is ready to begin. What I also loved about this was how basically does a lot of homages to other fantastical stories. Some people might say it's copying it. Personally, I think she's just trying to pay homage to it. That she's trying to say, hey, let me pull from all these beautiful different types of stories. The most obvious one here is the Improbable Road, which is like a golden road, like the Yellow Brick Road in The Wizard of Oz, which, to be honest, the Impossible City is very Oz-like as well. Like, you can see it here. I think it's like a big castle, which I think is the Impossible City. And then there were things like giant owls, which to me felt like they were pulling from Lord of the Rings eagles. We have these king and queens of cups and shade or whatever, and to me that felt like it was pulling from Alice in Wonderland. So it felt like we get little tidbits of different stories sprinkled in here in a way that I absolutely adored, and it was beautiful, it was profound. And I also want to add that I read this with the e-arc before, then I listened to this via the audiobook, this time on script, and I loved it. The narrator of this book is phenomenal. His ability to do these voices, especially of the creatures, is just so great. The bumblebee, or the bumble bear, I mean, it was so great. My favorite voice of the entire book, which, if you don't know what a bumble bear is, I mean, it's the name, the bumble bear. That's what we have in here, and I love it. It's so great. And I also just love the narrative. I think it's a beautiful, cute narrative, even if it is meant to sort of represent a deeper story within Middle Game, which is itself very dark. I'm excited to see where it goes. Where would I put it in relation to all these other books? At the very bottom. So let's just recap. The number 1 story is going to be book 2, Dynamite, Sticks and Bones. The number 2 story is going to be In an Absent Dream. The number 3 story is going to be Every Doorway, book 1, the introduction. The 4th place will be 3rd book, Beneath the Sugar Sky, the Nonsense World, My World. Then we'll have in the 5th place the 5th book, Come Tumbling Down. And then we'll have the newest book, Across Greengrass Close, whatever. And then finally, books place 7, we put this one. So not as good as Wayward Children series, but I think it stands up well enough. So before I get to my currently reading, let's talk about one more book that I read this week, and that is going to be Seb Fox, The Light Ages. This is an arc that I got last year. It was published in November, and I had hoped to read it in November. I did not get to it, but I ended up reading it this month, even though it wasn't on my TBR, because, I don't know, I found myself getting off my TBR. But I wanted to read it because I want to get ahead of my arcs. And also the story sounded really interesting. The story is supposed to be about the science of the Middle Ages, with the idea being that we have this idea of the Dark Ages being a time of no scientific advancement. And so Falk wants to challenge that idea. He thinks that's not true. And so he wrote this book to talk about the science of that ages. And when I first heard about this, I thought, okay, this is really interesting. We're going to think about like the machines we see in Game of Thrones, like that big spear, which I know is fictional, but it made me think, like, what kind of science was there to make them make this machinery? And it ended up not being about that at all. In fact, it did not feel like it was about science much at all either. It focuses on this one period of time around this one monk, because he has this book that the author is using that he's trying to use to sort of follow this time period. And while we get this historical context of this period, we get very esoteric scientific descriptions of some obscure things in science. Like, there are some things like map to clocks to some celestial science being done. He even throws in astrology, which to me seems like a bit of a stretch when talking about science, but I guess back then there wasn't enough evidence to say it wasn't a science. Well, the point is that we get this stuff sprinkled throughout. But a lot of it just feels very esoteric, and because it's really just structured into this main historical narrative of these really obscure figures in history, it just did not work. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars because I don't think it's a bad book. I like his writing, and he narrates the audiobook, which I listened to on script. He does an excellent job, which makes me think he's probably a good communicator as an educator. It's just that the book focused more on the history, the obscure history of this time period, and then on the very technical details of the science within this period, and it all just felt very dense, and I just could not get into it. Honestly, it felt like a chore by the time it was over. I just wanted it to be over with. I was not enjoying it. I can't even tell you the broad scale scope of what we actually talked about. I don't really understand historical context because he was talking about such obscure figures that don't mean anything to me. Like, it was too much over too quick a period, I suppose. And all I can really say are those obscure pieces of science that I remember him talking about. And big picture though, I don't think he got his point across very effectively. I think he was trying to make a point, but what he really wanted to do was just talk about this one period of time. He wanted to give historical setting and make this historical setting seem more interesting, which I guess it does make it seem more interesting, but the setting itself makes the science seem less interesting. So unfortunately, this book just doesn't work for me. If it sounds intriguing, I suggest you check out the description and see if that sounds interesting to you, because I don't think it's a badly written book. I just don't think it talked about what I wanted to talk about. So this really wasn't a book for me, even if it isn't necessarily just an objectively badly written book. So that was 3 stars. Now, over the weekend, I am reading a couple books. I have this ongoing book that I've been reading all month, which is Love, Beyond Space and Time, an Indigenous LGBT sci-fi anthology. This is the last book I've been reading for an ongoing reading vlog, where I'm reading one booktubers' favorites. This was supposed to be done by now, and the fact that it's not done is part of the reason why I'm reshaping my TBR, because I had a themed vlog planned for the last week of January, and now I'm realizing that I still have backlogs of vlogs like this one that needs to go up. So I figured I'm just going to cancel that and use the time to read some of my arcs, and I'm actually enjoying the process. I'm also fitting in a reread of the Yola stories by Joel Gomez, and this is a historical fiction novel about this queer black ex-slave who becomes a vampire, and her story living throughout this time as time is changing. And I remember the story focusing on first her transformation and then her observations of society changing through time. And in that sense, it's a broad scale analysis of how society is changing. And I've only just started this, maybe like half an hour into the audiobook, but it's really interesting. It's a really well told book, and I remember really liking it. That said, it did not stick out much several months later, because I read this back in October, and I need to do a discussion for this with Erica from The Broken Spine on Sunday, which I'll make sure I'll link below. Make sure you check that out. It's going to be a great discussion. But I wanted to reread it, and I'm really glad we ended up waiting this long, because I finally got the opportunity to reread it, and it's going to be right before we talk about it, which is great, because I tend to forget books pretty quickly. So I'm rereading it for that purpose, and I think it'll be great. I'm enjoying it. I think it'll make for an enjoyable weekend, and hopefully we'll have a better discussion for it. I told like 20 minutes about the Wayward Children's series, and now spent like 5 minutes on this last couple stuff. But that's everything that I've been reading, everything I'm reading right now. Honestly, the purpose of this video is more to talk about the Wayward Children's series, but I wanted to fit in some extra stuff. I mentioned changing my TBR because I am reading this book, which I didn't mention this, but I'm slow reading this. That's something where I'm actually reading with my eyes instead of my ears. I had several books like this carry over from last month. So because of that, I've ended up taking off my TBR, Woman Class Other, which was my anti-racist book of the month. And I'm going to replace it with another anti-racist book that I have from NetGalley that I'm going to read instead, which is about Indigenous rights. It talks about Indigenous people in Canada, I believe. It'd be interesting, because I think it's the first time I've actually read a anti-racist book that isn't centered on black individuals as opposed to Indigenous individuals. I do still want to read Woman Class Other. It's just that I'm realizing that while I may be able to find time to slow read a book, I still only have so much patience, the ability to focus, and that's evident by the fact that I'm still very little into this book, and I still have so much left. So ultimately, this isn't going to fit into this month, and that's where we're at. We're halfway through January. Honestly, this month feels like it's going by so slowly. I'm sure by the time it's over, I'll feel differently, but it's been a really good reading month. I've read 14 books. Granted, a lot of them were novellas, but I guess I'm on track, numerically speaking. I'm getting my page numbers, even if I'm not sticking to my TBR, which I'm not stressing about that. I know I promised you a TBR, but that's just a goal, and if things fall apart, they fall apart. But that's where I'm at. Let me know how your reading's going this month, what you're reading this weekend, and as always, hope you have a great day and stay safe. Goodbye, everyone.